Your Excellencies, dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my absolute honor to be here and to be invited to this event to share my knowledge and experience with such an esteemed audience. First of all, I want to thank CWC team for putting this event together, great content of which is capable of transforming the way we see our problems, the way we approach our issues, and the way we interact between ourselves, and of course, ignite us to open up to a change. I'm meeting a lot of very experienced, very knowledgeable people here, and for those of you who I haven't yet had the privilege of meeting and talking to, if you feel inspired by the speech of myself, Yelena, and the panel discussion led by Lori, please approach us. Please make sure we talk, and please make sure we ignite that the knowledge sharing that we all are here for. Today, I'm going to talk about tender procedures and their key role in ensuring smooth implementation in the oil and gas industry for upstream, downstream, and midstream projects, and of course for infrastructure projects, for upgrades projects. And I want to talk about my experience. I want to summarize some international experience and what can be and may be recommended and may be implemented in Iraq. I genuinely want to avoid making any concrete suggestions from a policy perspective, as every country is unique and every country requires individual approach to its challenges, to its issues, strengths and weaknesses. However, I will tell a few stories and then I will share the best practice which I had the privilege of learning and implementing in my own career. So after decades of war, unhealthy regimes, sanctions, and disturbance in Iraq, Iraq is now emerging as one of the region's most important economies. And the International Energy Agency has identified that they believe that within the next 20 years, Iraq will overtake Russia as the second largest oil exporter in the world. And of course, Iraq has, as was mentioned here, Iraq has huge gas reserves and mineral deposits and strong agricultural tradition, which is due to fertile lands which are watered by two amazing rivers. And as was mentioned here, natural gas will play a larger role in Iraq's future as it reduces oil dominance in the domestic energy mix. And of course, utilizing Iraq's associated gas is fortunately seen as a very vital step. But let me talk about tender procedures. Being an integral part of the entire investment climate of any country, and certainly the vein of any project implementation. It all starts with investors look at the opportunity for the foreign direct investment and looking at what they can assess and what they can look at and assess numerically. The political risk is always seen as a challenge, but it's very difficult to assess it numerically. Instead, what they always look at is the opportunity to interact efficiently with the government, and also they look at the tender procedures, in-country tender procedures, which prevailing and are reflective of the country's mentality, country's way of thinking, and country's approach to procurement. Any investor will want to see how empowering, how efficient are in-country procurement procedures for their own projects, and how efficient can be communication with the authorities and with the NOCs and IOCs. So a key concern for foreign companies doing business in Iraq, let me show you the next slide. A key concern for companies doing business in Iraq is, and the principal question for countries doing business in Iraq is If laws and regulations related to public procurement procedure in light of the recent and latest OECD initiative require public procurement regulations to become more clear, more transparent, more efficient, what tools and mechanisms I, as a foreign investor, do have to implement my best practices into the project that I'm stepping into? And the first issue, before I come to this example, and the first issue we often see is the lack of clarity whether public procurement regulations are applicable to private sector. From years I spent working with commercial contracts in Iraq, I have seen many occasions where one of the bidders, or all of the bidders, or all of the contractors, and I'm now getting very practical here, will be hit with one or few rules from public procurement regulations. Few other countries I worked with had to make that decision once and for all. Public procurement regulations should not apply to upstream sector, should not apply to private sector. Instead, and the laws and regulations do not have to exist for the upstream sector development. Instead, there should be a clear and very efficient tender documentation agreed between the government, NOC, or IOC, the operator, with the contribution of contractors and suppliers who will be delivering the stuff and who will be participating in those procurement processes. And this approach brings much stronger outcomes, I would say, for procurement, as I will explain a bit later. My message here is we cannot cancel single source procurement. Let's talk about single source procurement. And let me give you an example from Russia's biggest integrated oil and gas project. Yelena will mention much more in terms of details about that project. But when I say we cannot cancel the single source procurement, let me tell you about the LNG process licensors. LNG is the different industry, but it's still a hydrocarbon-based industry. And there are only 6 process licensors available around the globe to grant that license to an operator to be able to liquefy natural gas and finally receive the outcome as LNG, which is a very efficient source of energy these days. So the decision on which process licensor will the operator use is an extremely strategic decision. It has to be made for a lifetime of the project. You cannot change the licensor in the midst of the project. That's one thing. But also it has to be made as early as with FID, or better, even before FID. How can someone explain me how competitive tendering, or open tendering for that matter, can be applied to such a strategic and intricate decision? What I'm trying to say here is that I believe linear procurement approaches can cause harm to the project implementation, to project schedules, and they do cause harm to countries' investment climates. And if that recognized at all levels in the countries that deal with resources extraction, that would make the project's implementation much more efficient. So in this story, for Sakhalin-2 project, knowing that there are only few process licenses for LNG, we went for Shell Global Solutions, and Shell was the biggest shareholder of the project, and the process license for LNG was procured, which means the procurement cycle is full on, but it's a single source, apparently it's a single source procurement. It's a very special procurement, and that's in our procurement procedures. There was single source procurement, competitive tendering, but there were always special cases, and that was one of them. And the license was granted for train 1 and 3. The next event when we had to deal with SGSI was when the license was purchased for the train 3. But between train 1 and 2 and train 3, there was another major event that happened. And that is Gazprom became a major shareholder of the company. And the approach is different to single source procurement, to special items procurement. Well, what I want to say is if we would not have support and understanding from the governmental officials and their willingness to learn the complexity and the intricacies of the decision like that, we would have wasted a lot of time on tendering out for the license. So the overarching message that I want to bring is that cheapest bidder approach is slightly outdated and is worldwide is aided by a lot of other approaches which we can look at. And there are thousands of procurement professionals working in the field that see and learn, and we can learn from them now, and we just need to let them talk and let them speak and let them train us sometimes. So what we can learn from the field? The tender procedures always entail the interaction with suppliers, the overall interaction with contractors and bidders who become then suppliers, and the entirety, the tender itself contains the entirety of the future contractual relationship. Chartered Institute of Procurement Supply, being one of the biggest, strongest influencers in the world of procurement, and I have a pleasure of being affiliated with them as I trained hundreds of procurement professionals in MENA region. They have admitted long time ago that supplier relationship management is absolutely critical for the smooth implementation of any procurement goals, of any procurement plans. And only with having strong supplier relationship, we, as investors, operators, governmental officials, we can ensure that the mere goal and the only goal of procurement is attained. And that is, I'm getting from the contractor what I've ordered on time and on budget. That's the mere goal of procurement. Yet without supplier relationship management, we are not getting there very often. So, regrettably, what I see, and now a little bit of couple of sad stories, what I see is that the operators, the relationship starts with development of relationship starts with operators offering their terms and conditions within the invitation to tender, and then within the finalization of the contract document, and the terms and conditions, as operators believe, should be non-negotiable. I have no sympathy for that position, as that position, I don't negotiate my terms and conditions, leads to losing millions of dollars on every single project. I handled templates creation for the biggest and largest major operators in the world. It is not possible in advance of the project for any lawyer, 20 lawyers, 100 lawyers, or procurement professionals to create templates that will cover the complexity and the intricacies of the future project. It's just not possible. So whenever we take the terms and conditions and we impose them on our suppliers, believe me, we are building the way to lose millions of dollars. And Oman is doing that, companies operating in the UAE are doing that, Qatar is doing that, and I will come back to a couple of examples. I don't think operators should be legitimized when it comes to, I don't negotiate my terms and conditions. Negotiation is the essential part of supplier relationship management. But what I see a few years after, operator will complain that contractor didn't deliver what they promised to deliver. Well, did they have a chance to look at the contract? Did they ever had a chance to negotiate? Did they ever had a chance to suggest you something? No, you just dropped the contract on their desk, that was signed, and you imposed it on them. And that's the result we are getting. Another point here is claims handling. And claims handling is the process that every operator needs to streamline, of course. And what the example I want to make is that very often in upstream, midstream, downstream projects, operators don't tend to claim until the very final stage of the contract life cycle. At that time, the only thing they have to, the only mechanism they have to claim is they deduct liquidated damages, being 10% from the final invoice. Deal done. Qatar being one of the most vivid examples of how punishing rigid, stringent practices do not work for us. They just don't serve us and our ambitious plans and goals. You know, they're just impediment for that. Every single bidder, every single supplier, every single contractor in Qatar now builds in 10% into their contract price. At this stage is out of control, it's inevitable, and it's absolutely unstoppable. And that's the example of how our let's punish everyone across the board, of how that principle can just work against us. This is a real practical story from what I have to deal sometimes as a consultant. I represent the smaller supplier who's been punished for $1 million of liquidated damages. They had more than 6 contracts with the operator of West Kurna 2 project. And there is a very interesting story where the documentation to be signed that the smaller supplier received had mistakes in it. There were errors as to delivery times and as to prepayment. Supplier didn't want 50% prepayment. They just couldn't produce the bank guarantee as big as that. The changes of the contract to reduce the prepayment to 5%, something that supplier could absorb and could guarantee of the bank guarantee would be issued. That change took 6 months. We all know how processes are slow in big corporations, and procurement processes tend to be quite slow as well. So that 6 months caused supplier to lose the window opportunity with the manufacturer. They just lost the window and they couldn't supply on time. And part of the equipment on top of that was requested by the company midway to be detached from the big equipment, and let me call this one as a strategic equipment, but it's a little one. And the company realized halfway that it has to obtain the special permit for that little part. That little part, 4 years after the contracts were finished, is still with supplier. There is no permit for that. Yet, the company was forced, in a sense, and was incentivized to punish this supplier with $1 million LDs. It will never work for this industry. That rigid across-the-board application of liquidated damages or penalties will never work for us. Let me do the following. I know I promised not to make any concrete suggestions, but what I would suggest to any resources extracting countries, on any resources extracting economies, is to think of streamlining and, I guess, maintaining the efficient communication with the field professionals, with procurement professionals. What I suggest every country considers is creation of a tender and contracts council. The main goal of a tenders and contracts council would be to share the knowledge and experience. And there are 5 ways I identified in a little sort of tender and contracts council program, how this sharing and how this sharing would happen and how it would work for the project's implementation. So first of all, the contract templates applied by the operators will have to be revisited, will have to be looked at. Are they efficient? Are they helping us to attain that mere goal of procurement? Or they work against us? I think you've pretty much grasped what I believe in. Then enforcement of the contracts. We will have to look at the customs rules and regulations. As part of my relationship with supplier, I need to be able to know whether that VAT exemption or customs duty exemption is actually working for smooth implementation of the projects, not against that. The next thing, the Council will look at the criteria for for procurement of strategic goods and services, of critical goods and services. Some operators like BP, Shell, Total will be ahead of others. They will be ahead of others, and they will have this enormous procurement experience where they know exactly how to choose the best drilling contractor, where they know exactly that the cheapest bidder doesn't work for them, and they know how to defend themselves to ensure that they, in juggling between the stringent procurement rules and the project implementation timelines, they actually, deliver the projects on time. So such organization, provided its total independence and provided it's filled with professionals from the field who just share from the practical level, to me, would unlock the potential that's inherent in Iraq. It has huge potential. I love traveling to Iraq, and I love Iraq, and that's why I work for many years with people and companies and businesses in Iraq. And I will stop here by saying thank you for listening. Please contact us after this part. I would love to connect with each of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. Really interesting concepts.